The single dad stood on the edge of the runway as dawn crawled across the sky, casting pale light over the silent air base, and though he tried to steady his breathing, his hands trembled against the cool metal railing because this morning was not, like the others this morning, carried a weight he had avoided for far too long, leaving his chest tight with the memory he could no longer outrun. Had been a mechanic for years, a quiet man who kept to himself, who worked the late shifts, who never complained even when exhaustion clung to him like another layer of grease and oil. Yet everyone on the base knew he had once been something more, something sharper, something dangerous, but no one dared to ask, and no one connected the single dad to the legendary pilot he once had been, leaving whispers in the hangar that carried the wrong stories. Only a few knew the truth, that he had not flown since the day the folded flag rested on his hands, the day his only son did not return from the same skies he now feared to look at, the day a medal was placed in his palm, cold and heavy and undeserved, or so he believed, leaving him anchored to grief that refused to loosen. He stood waiting for the briefing with his tool bag at his feet, pretending he was only there for maintenance reports and not the real reason he had been called in, for the general had requested his presence personally, and no one understood why, and even he could not guess the truth, leaving the air thick with questions he dared not speak aloud. Across the base, SEALs moved in formation, heading toward the morning drill, their boots beating a steady rhythm against the pavement, and though they were accustomed to danger and discipline, their eyes drifted toward the quiet mechanic, who walked with a stiffness that did not match his unassuming role, leaving them with a strange, uneasy curiosity. Rumors traveled quickly among them, whispers that he had once flown an A-10 with unbroken precision, that he had completed missions. No one could officially confirm that he had disappeared from the skies after something tragic happened, yet none of them knew the full story, and the man himself never offered it, leaving the truth floating like a shadow they could not grasp. When the loudspeaker crackled, calling personnel to the briefing room, the single dad exhaled, slowly bracing himself as he lifted his tool bag and headed across the tarmac, each step feeling heavier than the last, because he knew the meeting would pull him toward a past he had spent years avoiding, leaving him uncertain whether he was ready to face it. Inside the briefing room, the general paced with an unreadable expression, pausing now and then to glance at the empty seat reserved for the mechanic, a seat placed not in the back but at the front near the tactical screens, and every officer watching this arrangement felt a strange tension in their gut, leaving the room thick with questions. The single dad entered. Silence fell. A low, heavy silence that pressed against every wall as the general stopped pacing, stood tall, and turned toward him, and without hesitation the general stepped forward and offered a crisp salute, a salute none of the officers expected, a salute that sent a ripple through the room, leaving every soldier frozen in shock. The mechanic stood stunned, unable to move, feeling the weight of the gesture crash through him, because it was not meant for the man he pretended to be, but for the man he once was, the man he buried the day his son died. And the general held the salute, unwavering, waiting for him to acknowledge it, leaving him trapped between past and present. They finally returned the salute with a stiff motion, his throat tight and eyes burning, as the general gestured for him to take the front seat. And when he sat, every officer exchanged glances, for none of them could understand why a general respected him at a level even elite soldiers rarely experienced, leaving the room pulsing with suspicion. And a wealthy general dimmed the lights and activated the main display, showing satellite footage of an unidentified aircraft crossing restricted airspace, an aircraft flying with the signature movement of someone experienced, someone trained by the highest commands, someone who understood how to slip between radar grids and disappear into the clouds, leaving the officers leaning forward. Single dad stared at the screen, and something inside him tightened because he recognized the maneuver, the angling of the wings, the tilt in the climb, the rhythm of the turns, and no one else noticed the subtle hitch in his breathing as he realized who flew it, leaving his heartbeat pounding with old buried dread. The general explained that communications from the pilot carried fragmented data referencing a fallen soldier, referencing a mission classified beyond most clearances, referencing coordinates tied to a location that only one man on Earth could interpret. And the single dad felt his hands curl into fists as he understood exactly what the pilot sought, leaving the base unaware of the danger, whispered under his breath, "One name, only one," and the general looked at him with somber understanding because they both knew that this was no rogue aircraft, no stolen machine, no random incursion, but something deeply personal, something tied to the single dad's past and more painfully tied to the memory of his son, leaving him shaken to his core. A sudden alarm blared from the hallway and an airman rushed into the briefing room reporting an incoming transmission from the unknown aircraft, a transmission requesting permission to land, requesting a direct line to the mechanic by name, a request that sent every officer into stunned disbelief, leaving tension sparking across the room. The general ordered the transmission routed to the briefing room speakers, and static filled the air, followed by a voice altered by wind and distortion yet unmistakable to the single dad, a voice that carried history, a voice he never wanted to hear again, a voice that spoke his call sign with cold precision, leaving him frozen and placid. The officers watched the single dad as the voice continued, revealing that the pilot carried something belonging to his son, something recovered from a mission long believed impossible to reach, something that should have been lost forever, and the mechanic felt his breath catch as every buried wound reopened, leaving the room holding its breath. Aircraft approached the base at high speed, its engines echoing across the sky, drawing every SEAL, every commander, every mechanic outside to watch as it descended through the morning haze, and though no one understood why the craft carried such gravity, they all sensed something monumental was unfolding, leaving the air electric with anticipation. Single dad stepped outside among them, unable to believe what he was hearing, what he was seeing, his heart beating louder than the engines as the A-10 came into view, low, powerful, and scarred from a flight that should have broken it apart, and on the dashboard gleaming through the canopy was a medal, one he knew on sight, leaving his knees nearly buckling. It was his son's medal, the one lost with him, the one that should have been unreachable, the one that carried every memory he had spent years trying to survive. And the plane descended steadily toward the runway, glinting in the morning light, leaving every person on the base breathless. General stepped beside him, speaking softly but firmly, telling him that the return of that medal meant the past he had buried was no longer staying buried, and that whatever force brought it back was tied to something none of them were prepared for. Leaving the single dad staring at the landing craft with dread, the A-10 wheels screeched as they hit the runway, rolling toward the gathered soldiers, smoke trailing from its engines as though the plane had clawed its way back from a world it was never meant to return from, and the canopy began to rise, slowly revealing the silhouette of the pilot inside, leaving the crowd silent and stilled as the pilot stepped out onto the wing, their identity hidden by the glare of the sun. The single dad felt the hairs on his arms rise because he sensed that whatever came next would change everything he thought he knew about his son, about the mission, about himself, leaving the future trembling on a knife edge. The pilot lifted the medal in one gloved hand and pointed directly at him, wordlessly summoning him forward, and every SEAL, every commander, every airman watched as the single dad took the first hesitant steps toward the aircraft, unaware that the truth waiting for him would unravel his entire world, leaving the moment thick with suspense. The single dad moved toward the aircraft with slow, uncertain steps, feeling the world tighten around him as if every breath weighed more than the last, and the metal glinted in the pilot's hand like a shard of memory cutting through the fog he had lived in for years, leaving him bracing for the truth he feared to foresee. The pilot remained motionless on the wing, watching him with an intensity that made the SEALs stand rigid because they sensed this meeting was no ordinary encounter, and the general stepped back, giving the single dad space, knowing this was something only he could confront, leaving the air thick with anticipation. As he drew closer, he could hear the faint rasp of the pilot's breathing behind the visor, and he tried to steady himself, but the weight of his son's medal pulled at his soul, reminding him of the day he received the folded flag, reminding him of every mission that led to that moment, leaving his heart pounding unevenly. The pilot finally removed their helmet. The crowd inhaled sharply because the face revealed was not the one anyone expected. A young woman stepped forward, her features hardened by exhaustion and wine burned, her eyes sharp and unwavering, and she held the medal as if it burned Her hand leaving the single dad's stunch introduced herself as a member of the reconnaissance unit that had vanished years ago during the mission that cost his son's life, a unit believed wiped out without survivors, yet she stood here trembling, with adrenaline explaining she had escaped captivity days earlier and had flown straight to him because she carried something he needed to know, leaving the entire base silent. Single dad could barely form a response as she placed the medal into his hand, her voice unsteady as she told him his son had not died the way the official report claimed, that the mission had gone wrong because of betrayal, that the unit had been sold out to rogue forces operating beyond any nation's authority. Leaving him reeling, she spoke quickly as if afraid the truth would dissolve if she paused, telling him that his son died saving her, that he forced her into an escape shuttle before the ambush, that he handed her the medal with instructions to bring it back to his father if she ever made it out alive, leaving his vision blurring with grief. SEALs exchanged glances, struggling to absorb the revelation because missions like this were buried deep beyond clearance and only whispers survived. The years yet this pilot stood here with evidence, the medal, the aircraft, the scars, telling a story darker than any they had imagined, leaving their trust in official reports shaken. General demanded clarity, but the pilot shook her head, saying she could not reveal everything out here because she was being hunted by the same forces who ambushed their unit, forces now operating in secret across borders with access to stolen technology and intelligence, and she warned they would come for her and for the single dads soon. Leaving tension thickening, urged them to take the aircraft into lockdown, explaining that it carried data cores hidden within the frame containing encrypted recordings from the mission, and that these recordings proved the betrayal, proved the existence of a covert network working within their own ranks, and that the single dad's son had uncovered it before he died. Leaving the officers shifting uneasily, the general ordered the SEALs to secure the aircraft immediately, but the pilot grabbed the single dad's arm, stopping him and telling him he needed to hear the message his son left, because within the medal itself was a data chip, something she had inserted there to keep it hidden, something that contained his son's final words. Leaving him shaking, followed her into the hangar where technicians scanned the medal, revealing a hidden compartment, and inside they found the small chip glowing faintly under the lights, and the pilot urged him to place it into the console, saying his son had recorded it moments before the ambush, leaving him hesitating as the room held its breath when the recording activated. The sound of his son's voice filled the hangar, raw, quiet, steady, filled with resolve, and he spoke directly to his father, telling him there was a traitor among them, someone with high clearance, someone planning to dismantle their unit for personal gain, and he revealed he had discovered their identity. Leaving the single dad frozen voice continued, saying he knew he would not survive the mission, but he wanted his father to know he died protecting something important, and that the truth he uncovered had to be exposed because innocent lives would be lost if the traitor succeeded. Leaving tears burning in the single dad's eyes, then his son named the traitor, and the hangar erupted in shocked murmurs because the name belonged to a man still active, a man with influence, a man who had risen through the ranks since the mission, a man currently serving in a position with access to classified operations. Leaving the general's face hardening with disbelief, pilot warned them urgently that if she escaped captivity, then the rogue forces would soon realize she had broken free, and they would mobilize quickly to silence her and reclaim the stolen aircraft, and that the traitor his son named would likely be already moving to erase evidence. Leaving the urgency sharpening, the general ordered lockdown of the entire base, sealing the runways, shutting down communication channels, and placing armed patrols at every entrance, and he turned to the single dad, his voice low, demanding to know if he had ever suspected the man his son named, but the single dad shook his head, feeling guilt twist through him, leaving the question hanging as they prepared to review the data cores from the A-10. A sudden explosion rocked the far end of the base, sending shockwaves through the hangar, and alarms blared as emergency lights flashed, bathing everything in red, and the pilot shouted that they had found her quicker than expected. Leaving panic flickering across the room, SEALs raced toward the perimeter while the general ordered the tech teams to fortify The hangar and the pilot grabbed the single dad, pulling him behind a row of crates as another explosion shook the building because she knew the enemy was not targeting the base at random. They were coming specifically for her and the information she carried, leaving the danger closing in, and fire erupted outside, echoing through the walls as rogue operatives breached the outer gates using shock charges and suppressed weapons, moving with coordinated precision, indicating they had inside knowledge of the base layout and access codes, and the realization hit the general hard, leaving him glaring toward the direction of the named traitor inside the hangar. The single dad felt something shift inside him, something old, something he thought had died with his son, a steel hard resolve rising from the ashes of grief, and he grabbed a weapon from a nearby storage rack, his hand steady for the first time in years, leaving the pilot watching with knowing eyes. The operatives pushed closer, forcing SEALs into defensive lines, and the general shouted for backup air support, but the channels were jammed, meaning the traitors' network had already compromised their communication grid, and the base was effectively isolated, leaving them vulnerable. Under fire, the pilot urged the single dad to follow her to the aircraft, saying the encrypted data within had to be secured physically because if the enemy seized it, everything his son died for would be lost, and he nodded, following her as gunfire cracked through the hangar doors, leaving danger inches away. He moved through the shadows of the hangar, slipping behind equipment and wreckage as operatives breached the side entrance, firing blindly, searching for the pilot and the single dad. And the pilot whispered that they needed to reach the rear maintenance lift leading to the fortified archives below, leaving hope dwindling. He crawled under a row of wings as bullets pinged off metal, and the general coordinated from behind crates, directing SEAL teams to hold the line, but the enemy pushed harder, their movements too precise to familiar, confirming they had trained with special forces once before. Leaving a grim truth behind the mission, the single dad reached the lift panel, with the pilot typing the override code, her hands shaking, and the door opened just enough for them to slip inside before the lights flickered and cut out, signaling someone had tried to override the power grid from outside, and she slammed the emergency lock, leaving darkness wrapping around the moss. The lift descended. The pilot exhaled shakily, telling him there was more he needed to know about his son, that his son had not only uncovered a traitor but also predicted his death and left instructions specifically for his father, because he knew his father would be the one person capable of stopping the network that betrayed them. Leaving the single dad grimacing, the lift shook as another explosion hit above and dust rained down on them, reminding them that the base was still under heavy attack. But the pilot continued determined, saying his son had believed his father would return to the fight one day because there were secrets buried deep, a past linked to the same network, and that he was meant to finish what his son began. Leaving the single dad silent when the lift opened into the dimly lit archive chamber, the temperature dropped, the air thick with the hum of servers containing decades of classified information, and the pilot led him to a central terminal, urging him to plug in the data core from the aircraft before the enemy reached the lower levels, leaving urgency crackling through the air. Inserted the core, and files flickered across the screen, revealing encrypted logs, recordings, mission footage, and communication intercepts, all pointing to a shadow organization operating beneath official command structures, an organization manipulating missions for profit and power. And among the name, the single dad stared at the screen, unable to blink, as the final message from his son pulsed softly in the dark archive chamber, and the echo of the word settled into his bones, reminding him that danger walked closer than breath, leaving him trembling with the weight of revelation. The pilot stepped toward him, asking what the message revealed, but he held up a hand, trying to calm the pounding in his chest, because the truth his son had left was something he had buried long before the war, something that tied him to the same shadows that were now hunting them, leaving fear creeping up his spine. He finally spoke, telling her in a low, strained voice that before he became a single father, before he lost himself in grief, he had once belonged to a classified intelligence unit, a deep cover division that operated off the books, tracking rogue networks like the one his son discovered, and that he had left the unit when he realized someone inside was orchestrating missions for profit. Leaving Guilt resurfacing, the pilot listened in rigid silence, shocked because she realized his son had not stumbled into the truth by accident. He had inherited his father's unfinished battle and continued it unknowingly, and that meant the traitor who sold out their unit had once been close to his father, to leaving the threat tightening around the moss. They stood absorbed in the gravity of their shared histories. The ground above them shuddered with more explosions, and dust cascaded from the ceiling, indicating the enemy operatives had breached deeper into the base and were closing in on the archive chamber. And the general shouted through the emergency speaker, ordering them to evacuate, leaving dread rising. Single Dad refused, saying the data in the archive had to be transferred to an external drive or the proof of the network would vanish forever, and the pilot agreed, working quickly at the terminal, initiating a transfer that would take several minutes, and every second felt like a lifetime as gunfire echoed closer, leaving their hope-thinning Zeal teams tried to hold the corridor, but their voices over the calm grew strained, reporting heavy losses and enemy movement to synchronized to efficient, confirming the traitor fed them intel and access codes, and the general cursed angrily while rerouting forces, but the enemy kept advancing, leaving the outcome uncertain. Inside the archive chamber, the lights flickered again as the traitor attempted another system override, trying to corrupt the files before the transfer finished, and the pilot frantically re-entered commands while the Single Dad stood watch, his weapon aimed at the door as footsteps approached from the darkened hall, leaving tension sharp when the blast door buckled from a breaching charge. He braced himself, expecting enemy operatives, but instead the general staggered and wounded, holding his shoulder and warning them that the traitor was on the base and was coming in person because he wanted to kill the last two people who knew the truth, leaving the air freezing around them. The pilot and the Single Dad exchanged a glance, understanding that if the traitor reached them there would be no escape, and the general swayed, gripping a crate, telling them he had fought the man once already and barely survived, and that the traitor was no ordinary officer but someone trained to eliminate assets silently, leaving fear settling into every corner. The transfer hit 60% when a metallic clang echoed from the corridor, and the Single Dad recognized the rhythm of the footsteps, cold, controlled, familiar from years long past, and he felt his breath shorten as memories flooded back, because he knew that walk. He had heard it during missions, when he still trusted the man who betrayed them, leaving him frozen. The pilot read his expression, realizing he knew the traitor personally, and she whispered, asking his name, her voice trembling, but before he could speak the lights cut out, plunging the entire archive into darkness, and the only sound was the low hum of the servers and the soft, almost taunting footsteps drawing nearer, leaving hearts pounding. Single Dad lifted his weapon, listening intently, and the general rasped that the traitor used to lead interrogation units trained in moving silently in confined spaces, and that he carried a device capable of corrupting all nearby drives with a single pulse, meaning if he reached the terminal everything would be lost, leaving urgency burning. A beam of a flashlight sliced through the darkness from the hall, illuminating a shadow moving fluidly toward them, and the traitor's voice drifted into the room, calm, collected, mocking, asking the Single Dad if he ever told his son the truth about who created the network and why it was built in the first place. Leaving the pilot horrified, the Single Dad shouted back that his son died protecting innocent lives, while the traitor profited from their deaths, and the traitor laughed softly, stepping closer, telling him he still did not understand that the network existed long before either of them served, and that both father and son had simply played their parts in a legacy of shadows, leaving the truth twisting deep earth. Pilot inched toward the emergency power switch, hoping to restore partial lighting, but the traitor spotted her movement and fired a shot that sparked against the metal inches above her head, forcing her back behind a server stack as the Single Dad fired in return, not to kill, but to push him back, leaving the outcome uncertain. The general attempted to stand, aiming his sidearm, but the loss of blood made him stumble, and the traitor mocked him, calling him a relic clinging to obsolete principles, and saying the world had changed and only those willing to manipulate chaos would rise, leaving rage boiling in the Single Dad. The transfer crept to 80% when the traitor stepped fully into the archive, now visible in the faint red emergency lights, and the single dad saw the face of the man he once trusted, a man he once believed loyal, now smiling sharply as he lifted a small pulse device capable of erasing every file within seconds, leaving the room. Paralyzed pilot tried to distract him, shouting that the data was already backed up off-site, though it was a lie, but the traitor narrowed his eyes, realizing her bluff, and turned the device on, preparing to destroy everything. Yet, in that instant, the single dad lunged at him with a ferocity born from years of buried grief, leaving the two crashing to the floor. They struggled violently, trading blows in the dim red light, the pulse device sliding across the floor out of reach, and the traitor fought with tactical precision, while the single dad drew strength from memories of his son refusing to let the man responsible for his death escape, and the pilot crawled toward the device, fearing it would detonate, leaving desperation mounting. Traitor managed to get the upper hand, slamming the single dad against a crate, gripping his throat and whispering that his son's death was inevitable, that both father and son were threats to the network and eliminating them was part of the plan. But the single dad mustered the last of his strength and flipped him over, breaking free, leaving the fight raging on. Meanwhile, the transfer reached 95% and alarm warnings beeped softly, meaning any interruption would corrupt the files, and the general, despite his weakening state, crawled toward the terminal, using his body as a shield to protect it from stray gunfire, knowing the mission depended on it. Leaving courage etched into every movement, traitor retrieved a knife from his belt, lunging at the single dad with lethal precision, and the blade grazed his arm, drawing blood, but he countered, smashing the traitor's wrist against the floor, making the knife skitter away, and the two men locked eyes, filled with years of betrayal and unfinished conflict, leaving the next move uncertain. The pilot finally reached the pulse device, grabbing it, but to her horror it began counting down, a failsafe triggered by movement, and she screamed for the single dad and the general to take cover, but the single dad, realizing what it meant, tackled the traitor away from the terminal, away from the pilot, preventing him from activating anything else, leaving adrenaline surging. The countdown neared zero when the general, using the last of his strength, shielded the terminal with his body, and the pilot hurled the device into a containment chute designed for explosives, slamming it shut just as it detonated, muffled by the reinforced chamber, and the archive shook, but the data remained intact, leaving relief fragile. The traitor snarled, trying to escape, but the single dad pinned him down, demanding to know why his son had been targeted specifically, and the traitor laughed bitterly, saying the boy was too much like his father and that both were destined to uncover truths better left buried, and that killing them was a necessary evolution, leaving the single dad trembling with fury. Enforcement alarms blared above, signaling that remaining SEAL units had regained control of the base perimeter. After heavy fighting and footsteps thundered down the corridor as reinforcements approached the archive chamber, but the traitor attempted one final desperate move, reaching for a concealed pistol, leaving danger imminent. Bare he could fire, the single dad struck him with a final decisive blow, knocking him unconscious as SEALs burst into the room, weapons raised, assessing the scene quickly, understanding the magnitude of what had occurred, and the general collapsed from blood loss, finally allowing others to carry him for medical aid, leaving the room drenched in exhaustion. The transfer reached 100%, and the terminal emitted a soft chime confirming the data was saved and secured, and the pilot slumped against a wall, shaking with relief, while the single dad stood over the traitor, breathing hard, feeling the weight of victory and loss blending into something indescribable, leaving silence settling as the SEALs restrained